Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the Pied Piper of Pasadena Part 12. This is the story of Dean Corll. When we last left off, we had talked about how David Brooks would invite Elmer Wayne Henley to Dean Corll's apartment sometime in the winter of 1971. It is said by David Brooks that originally he had brought Elmer Wayne Henley over to the apartment as a potential next victim of Dean Corll. But what they had not counted on is Dean Corll taking actually a liking to Elmer Wayne Henley. And if you remember, Elmer Wayne Henley was one of the classmates and friends of Gregory Winkle and David Hilligeist that actually helped the parents go looking for the kids when they had actually been murdered by Dean Corll. In that first meeting between Elmer Wayne Henley and Dean Corll, Dean would actually approach Elmer Wayne Henley and ask him if he would be interested in doing some home invasions with him and David Brooks. And Elmer Wayne Henley, needing extra income, would actually agree to this. So the next following few weeks, Dean Corll, David Brooks, and Elmer Wayne Henley would perform a various of home invasions, and whatever money they would get from these home invasions, Dean Corll would split them between himself, David Brooks, and Elmer Wayne Henley. After they had performed various home invasions, Elmer would be approached by Dean Corll again, and he would ask Elmer if he would ever be willing to take a life, and Elmer Wayne Henley said he had no problem with that. I think this is kind of Dean Corll's way of slowly grooming Elmer Wayne Henley as a way to see what he could or could not do around him that he would be comfortable with. After this question, Elmer would be approached by Dean Corll once again, and Dean Corll would ask him if he would be interested in a little business that him and David Brooks were a part of. And it is at this point that Dean Corll will tell Henley that he was part of a child trafficking organization that was based in Dallas, and would tell him that if he would bring teenage boys to his apartment, he would pay him $200 per boy. But Elmer Wayne Henley would also say that when he had brought this to his attention, he was inwardly disgusted about the proposal, but he would politely decline and would just go about his business. It is also said that Henley, even though he did not like the idea of them trafficking children, he would still continue talking to Dean Corll and David Brooks and still hang out with them on a period of time. But because Elmer Wayne Henley was living at home with his mother and she struggled with bills financially, and part of the reason that he had dropped out of high school was because of the fact he would help work jobs so that his mother would not struggle with the bills as much, because they had 3 other siblings to think about. Eventually, Elmer Wayne Henley would think very much about Dean Corll's offer and would eventually go to Dean Corll and tell him that he would start luring boys into his apartment. In February of 1972, Henley would actually lure an unidentified teen to the apartment of Dean Corll. Once they were there, they would begin drinking and doing drugs. And at some point, Henley would put on a pair of handcuffs and immediately get out of it, as he knew this escape artist tactic. It would actually get the attention of the teen, and he would ask, "Can you show me how to do that?" To which Henley would ask him to put on the cuffs. And immediately after putting on the handcuffs, Dean Corll would press the teen down to his face and begin tying his feet together with a nylon cord. After this point, Dean Corll would get up and pay Henley $200, and Henley would walk out of the apartment. Under the premise, he had believed that Dean Corll was going to send him to the child trafficking ring in Dallas. But what would actually happen, as we both know, the teen would be strapped to the torture board that he had suspended in the ceiling, and he would be raped, sodomized, and strangled, and then buried. Dean Coral would later say he buried him in the boat shed. On March 24th, 1972, Frank Aguirre would finish up his shift at Long John Silver's where he worked at, and before leaving he would call his girlfriend and tell her that he would be home around 20 minutes. Upon walking out into the parking lot to get into his truck, he would be approached by Elmer Wayne Henley, and he would ask Aguirre if he would be interested in doing some drugs, and Aguirre would say he was very interested, so he would begin leading him to a windowless white van. There he would find Dean Coral and David Brooks sitting in the van. They would get inside the van and they would begin smoking weed. After they had smoked some weed in the van, Dean Coral would invite Frank Aguirre to his apartment for drinking and doing more drugs, to where Frank would say yes, so they would wait for him to get in his truck, and Frank Aguirre in his truck would follow Dean Coral, David Brooks, and Elmer Wayne Henley in the windowless white van to his apartment. Once inside the apartment, the boys would begin drinking and smoking weed, and like before, Elmer Wayne Henley would take out a pair of handcuffs and show him the escape artist tactic trick, to where Frank Aguirre would once again fall for this trick and ask, "How did you do that?" Once he would put on the handcuffs, like before, Dean Coral would go and press Frank Aguirre down, tying his feet with nylon cord, and would begin dragging him over to the torture board that was suspended from the ceiling. Once Henley had seen this, he began begging Dean not to kill Frank. And it is at this point that Dean Coral would look at Elmer Wayne Henley and give him a very, very creepy revelation. Before he would do anything to Frank Aguirre, he would reveal to Elmer Wayne Henley that the last boy that he had brought to his apartment was killed and was buried in this boat shed that he was renting for $20 a month. And he would even go further and tell Elmer Wayne Henley, "Remember your two friends Gregory Winkle and David Hellegeist that you'd been looking for? I killed them, and they are also buried at the back of the boat shed." After giving this haunting revelation, Dean Coral would strip Frank Aguirre, would torture, sodomize, and strangle him. And they would bury Frank at High Island Beach. After they had buried Frank's body in High Island Beach, Henley would actually, the next few days, would go over to Frank Aguirre's house, where his mother was passing out missing flyers for her son. And Henley would often ask for updates on Frank Aguirre, and his mother would give him a stack of papers to hand out around town to help find her son. After he would leave the house, he would drive down the road and just throw the pile of papers in a ditch. Mark Scott would be the next person of interest on our list. Mark Scott was also another former friend of Elmer Wayne Henley, and his mother would often recall that Henley and Mark would often hang out a lot, often staying the night at each other's house, and whenever Mark would throw a party at the home, Mark Scott's mother would recall that Henley was always the first one to show up and the last one to leave. And the last few weeks, Scott and Henley had actually been hanging out and partying a lot. Now, Scott had also found himself in some trouble with the law for a concealed weapons charge because he would have a knife in his pocket. Fearing for any more trouble with the law, Scott would actually approach his mother and say that he had thought about fleeing to Mexico. And on April 20th, Henley would lure Scott into Dean Coral's apartment, and when he would refuse to put on the handcuffs, Dean would try to put them on by force, to where Scott would pull out a knife and slash at Dean and make a minor surface wound on his stomach. Henley would then pull out a gun and place it in Mark's head. David Brooks would often say the moment he pulled the gun, he just gave up. And it is that point that Dean Coral would tie Mark Scott to his torture board.